Okay, this class is looking at the environmental impacts of agriculture. And here we can see an example of farming where we have terracing. And terracing is a means of soil conservation, which prevents erosion. So it's a sustainable practice. However, we can notice that the soil is waterlogged. It's probably something like rice which is growing, which thrives in waterlogged conditions. And of course, rice will, well, waterlogging, first of all, will reduce the nitrogen content of a soil. So you probably need to add um, nitrogen fertilizers at some point because the soil will become deficient in nitrogen. And also, rice requires high levels of phosphorus. I suppose having waterlogged conditions can also encourage the breeding of mosquitoes and so on. So there are some negative aspects with this type of farming, although the terracing is a good practice because it helps conserve the soil. So for the environmental impacts of farming, we need to look at health risks, threats to the sustainable livelihood of communities, land take, and pollution. So therefore, if you ask a question on the environmental impacts of farming, you need to mention all four of those uh, uh, things: health risks, threat to sustainable livelihood, land take, and pollution. And we're going to look at each of these in turn. So first of all, uh, farm workers can suffer health risks as a consequence of farming. These include increased risk of respiratory diseases, things like farming causes uh, dust in the air and so on. So risk from respiratory diseases will increase. Then you have noise-induced hearing loss, because farm machines can make loud noises. You can have skin disorders, such as acne, folliculitis, contact dermatitis, which is a type of eczema uh, caused by skin coming into contact with particular substances. Tinea pedis, a kind of that's athlete's foot. Onychomycosis, which is another fungal disease. Fungal diseases associated with farming. Certain types of cancer, uh, including multiple myeloma, which is cancer of the bone marrow. Myeloma, sorry, not sorry, prostate cancer, testis cancer, skin cancer. So there's a wide range of cancers associated with farming. Then you have chemical toxicity. Glyphosate, for example, is toxic to the liver, kidney, and skin cells, as well as being carcinogenic. So glyphosate has all of those characteristics. Of course, glyphosate is better known as Roundup. You can have heat-related illnesses, sunstroke, and so on, because farms can get hot. Then you have osteoarthritis. And agrochemicals can also harm consumers if present on produce. Sometimes people will spray crops with herbicide, and there's a residual amount on when it gets to the consumer. It's one reason why you've got to wash farm produce carefully before you consume it, because the agrochemicals on it can be harmful. Now, threats to sustainable livelihood of communities. If farms get larger, smaller farms get consumed by larger farms, which are more heavily mechanized. You know that quite often small farms can't make enough profit, and therefore these small farms slowly get consumed by larger farms. And this means that small farmers lose employment and local economy becomes stagnant due to a reduction in spending power of the masses. And such displaced farmers may try to use marginal land for farming and kind of clear away virgin land, and therefore destroying natural ecosystems. And the lack of social equity may cause an increase in crime rate and social unrest. So the lack of opportunities in the region may cause better qualified people to leave, causing a brain drain. So this can happen in rural communities as smaller farmers get replaced by larger farms. And of course, the larger farms tend to be more highly mechanized. And because of the high level of mechanization, uh, there's a smaller labor force needed. And agricultural profit may be threatened by cheap imports. And that's especially true in a country like Jamaica, where countries such as the USA often subsidize their farmers and buy surplus, and they do this to prevent a glut. And this surplus food is then dumped in developing countries and is sold at a fairly low price. And local farmers can't compete with these dumped foreign products. And this again makes it harder for local farmers to compete. But I suppose the point is that poor people can at least afford to buy the dumped food, which may not be possible from the locally produced food. And climate change also threatens agricultural productivity of communities. And decreasing social cohesion is also a threat to sustainability of communities. What happens is small communities no longer are as well connected as they were at one time. People will often work large distances away, and therefore they know each other less, and therefore there's less social cohesion. And again, this makes such communities less friendly. There's less of a community spirit, and therefore they may not be able to continue as they did at one time. Now, another aspect of impact of farming is land take. Vast amounts of land are needed for agriculture, resulting in land clearance. I mentioned this about the Amazon earlier, in the previous class. We're cutting down large amounts of the Amazon for farming, and there's a great loss in biodiversity. We've said several times, these large farms tend to involve monocropping, or at least have a very low number of different crops. And therefore there's a serious loss in biodiversity. So there's a significant habitat loss, resulting in reduction in biodiversity and ecosystem stability, Remember, as biodiversity gets less, ecosystem stability decreases as well. So ecosystems are going to become less and less stable. And then there's a series of YouTube videos which you can watch in your own time. Then pollution from an inappropriate use of agrochemicals. Pesticides can enter water bodies such as streams, rivers, lakes, groundwater, and oceans. And it can enter by leaching, runoff, accidental spillage, and fallout. And soil. Some of the pesticides sprayed on crops will fall or get washed into the soil, and it will kill important microorganisms, thus reducing plant productivity. And plants. Pesticides can get assimilated into plants and thereby into birds and other animals. And then we have something called biomagnification. Well, first of all, you have bioaccumulation, when pesticides get into fats stored in living organisms. And as you go down the food chain, organisms will, if you go up the food chain, you'll get more and more, a higher and higher concentration of the pesticide. And some pesticides have high levels of persistence, which means they stay around for a long time. And I gave an example. So that during the Vietnam War, which was in the late 1960s and early 70s, the US defoliated 11,969 square miles of rainforest. And the pesticide, which we did, well, the herbicide, you should have said, is still present in the area, and plants still not grow there. And the Agent Orange, which they use as an anti-defoliant, cause birth deformities and cancers. So these are the sorts of deformities which children are still born with because of the Agent Orange, which was sprayed kind of 50 years ago. And the deformities are still there. You see that, where the brain is outside of the head. And you can see deformities in the limbs as well. And this was the rainforest in Vietnam. This was before they sprayed Agent Orange. And this was afterwards. And of course, they sprayed the rainforest with defoliant, so the North Vietnamese soldiers had nowhere to hide. And there's a very good documentary dealing with that. It's kind of sobering to watch. I recommend that you spend time and watch it, because it really shows you how something sprayed a long time ago can still affect us even now. Following that, we have inorganic fertilizers. And the main environmental effect of fertilizers on the environment is contamination of water supplies, which causes eutrophication. And we can see an example of eutrophication here. We have a really thick layer of algae in the water, and therefore the organisms underneath can't possibly live. So eutrophication is caused by excessive nutrients, particularly ammonium ions and phosphate ions in the water body, and it leads to a build-up in the bacteria. Well, basically, the algae will die and be broken down by bacteria, and the bacteria use up all the oxygen. Later on, we'll learn about something called dissolved oxygen, and also biological oxygen demand. And what happens in eutrophication is the oxygen demand increases, and therefore the amount of dissolved oxygen gets less. So BOD, or biological oxygen demand, will increase, and therefore DO, dissolved oxygen, gets less. And inorganic fertilizers also kill soil microorganisms, causing a deterioration of the crumb structure of a soil. Another impact of agriculture is the use of antibiotics. And fish and animals are raised at high densities, often treated with antibiotics. And this leads to an increase in antibiotic-resistant bacteria, or bacterial diseases, and therefore it should be discouraged. But it runs against the interests of large businesses, so politicians are reluctant to ban their use. And there's an article here, which again is useful to read, where people, large businesses don't want bans on antibiotics because it will cut down on the amount of profit they make. So the impact of hormones given to animals on humans has not been fully investigated. There is evidence that estrogens given to chickens may promote early sexual development in girls and possibly the development of breast cancer later on. But the evidence isn't really conclusive. But really we need to find out quickly because it's a bit late discovering it if girls are already developing breast cancer. So in the it's best to be on the side of caution and avoid such chickens. And in aquatic organism, antibiotics and hormones can escape into water bodies, and again it can help bacteria to become antibiotic resistant. And basically that finishes this presentation.